Good afternoon. My name is Finbarr, Roche, CEO of Fighting Blindness, and you are very welcome this afternoon. As CEO of Fighting Blindness, we are delighted to welcome you to our webinar on the topic of age-related macular degeneration. Today is a continuation of our work in this area, following on from the hugely successful Retina International World Congress that took place in June. Our work in rare disease, vision research, and research in AMD continues, and the results are showing. We want to hear from you about what is important to you and what supports you would find useful. There is a lot of work to be done in championing your voices and making sure that the research, treatments, and support needs you have are being met, and that you are part of every stage of designing and delivering these supports. We also hope that the work that we do brings hope that better treatments and one-day cures will be available. I'm delighted to introduce our fantastic lineup of speakers for you today. Our first speaker, Mr. Mark Cahill, is a consultant eye surgeon specializing in retinal diseases at Progressive Vision, and today he will speak about clinical care for AMD. Our second speaker, Professor Matthew Campbell, is Professor in Genetics and Head of Department at the Smurfit Institute of Genetics in Trinity College Dublin. Joining Professor Campbell is our third speaker, Professor Sarah Doyle, Associate Professor in Immunology and Head of the Immunobiology Research Group at Trinity College Dublin, and together they will speak about ongoing scientific research into AMD. You will hear also from Marta O'Connor, our Head of Support at Fighting Blindness, and Declan Mina, our Advocacy Officer, about the ongoing work of Fighting Blindness in support of those affected by AMD. I hope you find this webinar useful, and please stay involved. Join our VIP network if you are interested in getting involved in research and advocacy, and reach out to our support service. There is hope and support for you now and in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Finbarr. Great to welcome everyone here today. We're delighted to have so many people join us during the day. So before we kick off, we just have some brief housekeeping to go through. I won't keep you long. And for this, sorry, it's just a bit slow. Sorry. So first, welcome. We just want to let everyone know this webinar is being recorded. So it will be available then after the webinar on our Fighting Blindness website and on our YouTube channel. It would also be available then through a link that will be sent to attendees afterwards. So as well as that, just to know that questions can be submitted through the Q&A box, and questions will only be seen by the hosts. And if you like, you can submit them anonymously as well. We are aware that some members have sent ahead some questions to us, so thanks very much for that. We've noted them. So just briefly to give you a talk through the agenda, as Finbarr mentioned, our first speaker will be Mr. Mark Cahill, a consultant eye surgeon, who will then be followed by Professor Matthew Campbell and Professor Sarah Doyle in Trinity College Dublin. And then our final speakers will be Declan Mina, our Advocacy Officer, and Marta O'Connor, our Head of Support Services. So after that, we will then have a panel Q&A session. So any questions you have for all of our speakers, you can then mention at that stage. So I'll stop sharing my screen there, and I'll introduce our first speaker, Mr. Mark Cahill.
Great, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk today about really what's available as treatment for. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Great. Okay, thank you. So just going to talk about current clinical care for age-related macular degeneration. And to start off, I know we all know that we have that about our eyes, but how they work can sometimes get a little confusing. And there's two straightforward jobs for our eyes to do. The first is to focus light from the outside, which is done by the front part of the eye. That's the clear part called the cornea. A fluid-filled space behind it which is what you see when you look at your eye from the front, but you have to really appreciate it by looking from the side. And behind the fluid-filled space is the colored part of our eye, which is the iris, and the central black spot is called the pupil. And behind that, there's a lens that looks like an old-fashioned jelly tot sweet. Kids don't eat jelly tots anymore, but that's exactly what the lens looks like. And that focusing part, focus light onto the inside of the eye, which is in darkness, and it is like a camera obscura. It makes an image in our brain, which is upside down and back to front. And the thing that does that is called the retina, which is transparent, and it looks like wet kitchen paper in real life. You can move it around and it can detach, and it sits on pigment. And the retina is turning light into electricity. That electrical signal is sent down a nerve to our brain. And the back of our brain, called the occipital lobe, is analyzing that information, which comes as an on-off signal. You then send that signal usually to the left side of your brain in your temporal lobe, and you evoke memories. Whether the memory is a piece of text or it's an image, that memory evocation is predictive, and it's happening all the time. And that's what your eye is doing. So the generation of the electricity is best in the center of the eye at a place called the macula. And that's where you get the idea of macular degeneration. The retina has two main layers. It has an inner layer, which has its own blood supply. And that's predominantly where the nerves are being gathered to be sent out of the eye along the optic nerve. And the outer retina has photoreceptors sitting right next to the pigment. And those photoreceptors have chemicals in them, which have been there since you were developing at the age of 4 weeks in the womb. And those chemicals are turning light into electricity, day and night. And if you look inside the eye, it looks, when you shine a light into the eye, which is normally dark, it looks like a nice orange color. That's because the light is reflecting off the pigment, which is a brown velvet color. And that's the two images that you see on the top, on the right and the left. And underneath, you have a cross-section using an OCT through the retina on either side. And in the center, there's a color representation of a cross-section through the retina, highlighting the various layers of the inner retina and then the outer retina. And two really important layers that we're going to talk about are the photoreceptor thickness, and there's an area there called the ellipsoid zone, and underneath that, the RPE layer thickness, the retinal pigment epithelium. And so the photoreceptor thickness and the RPE thickness are new ideas and new concepts that are going to be very important in understanding how to treat macular degeneration better. So age-related macular degeneration is something that affects us as we get older. And what happens is yellow spots appear under the retina, usually after the age of 50. It can be earlier. And those yellow spots are called drusen because they were first described by a German ophthalmologist in the late 19th, early 20th century. And drus is the German for body. And if you've got 5 drusen, then you've got macular degeneration, 5 to 20 of them. And those drusen have different appearances. Some of them are small, some of them are bigger, and some of them start to touch off each other and coalesce. You also can get changes in macular degeneration where the pigment are under the retina becomes thin. But the key thing to understand macular degeneration is it always starts off as dry macular degeneration. Dry macular degeneration is the type that affects 90% of people with macular degeneration. Relatively few people develop wet macular degeneration. So dry macular degeneration is a very big challenge to how to prevent that from progressing. And so if we look at the progression of dry macular degeneration, recently in the last year, in order to try and help people understand what's happening in their eyes, and also to help us as both doctors and researchers to try and focus on where we need to really identify patients who are at risk of losing their vision, dry macular degeneration has been broken down into 3 stages. Early dry macular degeneration, stage 1, where you have small drusen when we look into your eye at your macula. Stage 2, and this is a crucial stage, is called intermediate dry AMD. It's where the drusen become thicker and bigger, and they have a minimum, if you have one that has a size of 125 microns or bigger, then you've now reached what's called intermediate dry AMD. And this is a very important checkpoint. When you get to this point, then treatments need to start to be considered. From stage 2, dry macular degeneration, as you get older, and stage 2 dry macular degeneration, typical seen in patients around the age of 70 to 75. You then have 15 years to live typically. You are likely from stage 2 to advance to stage 3, dry macular degeneration, where you start to develop pigment loss. And that pigment loss comes, we call that geographic atrophy. So 2 terms that are really important to understand in dry macular degeneration is stage 2 intermediate dry AMD with large confluent drusen. That's the first key point. And the second key point is the onset of geographic atrophy. The idea of a Mediterranean diet is really has really been looked at extensively in the United States by the AREDS group, which is led by an Irish doctor. Your diet will, and change in your diet will really reduce the chance of you progressing from stage 2 intermediate dry AMD to stage 3 geographic atrophy, particularly if you don't eat a lot of red meat, you eat more fish, if you eat whole fruit, if you reduce your alcohol consumption. And that really is, that's less than 2 units a day is the absolute minimum. So that's the first thing, is the diet. The second thing that's really important is to understand what happens when the dry macular degeneration progresses. So if you look at this, these are images from one person, their right and their left eye, and the upper set of images is at presentation, and the lower image is where the geographic atrophy has progressed. And you can see that the black arrows are pointing out in the top slide. There's a small area on the right where there's geographic atrophy, and there's a mottled appearance in the left. If you look down on the right eye where the black arrows are, where it says VA624, the geographic atrophy has got much worse, both on the right eye and in the left eye. And the person's vision has changed because of this progression, which was in the space of about 18 months. So they've been able to drive, from being able to drive, their vision is 6.9 in their left eye to 6.18 in their left eye and 6.24. So that is an example of this progression of geographic atrophy in people, and typically in their mid-70s. So 74, if you look at a group of people who are 74 and have macular degeneration, 6.2% of them will have geographic atrophy, which is going to progress in 60% of people within 5 years, so from 74 to 79. And they also have a risk of developing wet macular degeneration, because we know that geographic atrophy progression is associated with converting to and from wet macular degeneration. If you are 74 and you don't have any geographic atrophy, you have a 19 to 20% chance in 4 years, that you will develop geographic atrophy and start on this path where you're going to lose your vision. So geographic atrophy is a massive challenge now that we can treat people with injections in their eye. So this is where 2 treatments have been approved by the FDA. The first is called a Valida light treatment. Now, this is a treatment where 3 wavelengths of light are shone into the eye. It's a cycle of treatment. It's 3 treatments a week for 3 out of 5 weeks, and it's best if it's repeated at 4 to 6 month intervals. It's recently been approved by the FDA. And its 2 main treatments are to try and reduce the size of the drusen at stage 2 intermediate dry AMD, so that there's less drusen that is also associated with increased vision. And the second thing it can do, it can reduce the progression of the geographic atrophy, so you don't end up with loss of pigment in the center of your vision, and that results in you having poor vision. The treatment itself is not painful. It takes about 20 minutes per each treatment visit, and there's 9 visits in the total cycle. Immediately after the treatment, there can be an after image, and so we have to be careful that people don't leave straight away. Make sure that they're not too dazzled. Now, when the treatment was studied, patients either got 3 wavelengths of light shone into their eye over the period of the study, or they got less light shone into their eye. So the sham treatment is actually a little bit of this of these wavelengths of light are towards the red end of the spectrum. So if you look at the graph on the left, it shows what happened to the person's vision who had stage 2 dry macular degeneration. And the top line shows that if you get the full treatment, your vision improves over a 24-month period. And the improvement is fairly spectacular. It's 5 letters or more, which is really incredible. The sham treatment, there is an improvement in the vision, which wanes. But don't forget, they're actually getting a little bit of light treatment, not the full strength. The other really exciting thing is the effect on geographic atrophy. And if you give people full treatment of Valida and compare it to the sham group, those people who got the full treatment with Valida, so they're at stage 2, confluent drusen, their progression rate to geographic atrophy was 1%. Whereas in the real world, it's 20%. If you don't treat somebody, we've just talked about it in the ARED study of thousands of people in the United States, their natural progression at 74 is that in 4 years, 20% of people will develop geographic atrophy. So the Valida reduces that down to 1%. The people who got the sham treatment, they had a 10% risk. So the lower level of light treatment, which is used as the control, also has an improved outcome in the natural history of progression of geographic atrophy. And this is really exciting because the treatment is non-invasive. The downside of the treatment is that you have to have it repeated. But for some people who are at stage 2 and have an early area of geographic atrophy, it's a good treatment choice. Now, the other thing that's really exciting in the United States is inhibition of C3, which is a complement factor. This significantly reduced the progression of geographic atrophy in patients. And it also significantly reduced the loss of photoreceptors. So the photoreceptors became less thin in this natural progression geographic atrophy, and the RPE became less thin. And these graphs are showing that. The top lines are where the people didn't get treatment, and the bottom lines are where people either got treatment every month or every 2 months. And it's a really exciting treatment. And there was 2 studies that looked at it called Oaks and Derby. It's approved by the FDA about 18 months ago. And unfortunately, this has not been approved by the EU. Much to our shock, in September, the European Medicines Agency decided not to approve C3 inhibitors. And I think in the clinical community, we think this was a mistake. Progressive Vision has put forward a patient for advocacy reasons for another complement inhibitor, but that medicine has also been withdrawn. It hasn't been not approved, but it's been withdrawn by the company as they're seeking another strategy. Now, we think that this is a mistake. And the reason we think it's a mistake, because if you use artificial intelligence to look at images, particularly OCT images from patients with geographic atrophy, patients who have thick photoreceptors and thinning of the pigment, if you give them these complement inhibitors, you reduce the chance of the geographic atrophy progressing by 77%. So you just apply an artificial intelligence app onto an image, and it will tell us as doctors who's at risk of progressing quickly, because we know that geographic atrophy progresses in different ways in different people. So I think that this, even though we don't have the C3 inhibitors, we are going to be applying this idea of fast progression in dry AMD to most of our patients over the next few years, and be offering them certain treatments or dietary advice based on our analysis of the thickness of some of the layers in the retina. And this is very exciting. And these 2 images show you during the Derby study and the Oaks and Derby study, this is showing what happens to the RPE and the pigment layer over time. In the left eye that says fellow eye, that's where they weren't getting treatment. And in the right eye, where the person, in the right image, you can see how it slows down loss in the very center of the retina. Now, just to talk about treatment of wet macular degeneration to end, this has been one of the most exciting things that's ever happened in eye medicine, being able to give people back vision when they develop wet macular degeneration. So that's where we give anti-VEGF injections injected into the eye at regular intervals. If you look at the image set on the right, there is blood under the retina of this patient. And if you look at the OCT underneath that, there is thickening of the retina. And after injections of a medicine called Vabysmo, the blood has completely gone. The patient's vision has improved to driving level. And you can see that the retina is still a little thick, but that the blood is completely gone. And this is absolutely revolutionary. And these have been studied for 20 years. There's a bunch of different medicines. And you may have heard of some of these. There's a thing called Avastin, which was the original one that works very well, but you have to have a lot of them because it doesn't work very long. You have a thing called Lucentis, which is not as used as much because it has a relatively shorter lifespan in the eye. You've got Eylea and Vabysmo, and the Eylea and its higher sister concentration of Eylea, 8 milligrams, and Vabysmo can last much longer. And the thing about the wet macular degeneration is it's very similar at the age of onset to dry, so age 75. You've typically got 15 years to live, and our goal with these injections is to try and maximize the vision once we get the wet macular degeneration treated earlier. Don't forget, when we give you the injections for wet macular degeneration, we're putting it back to stage 2 dry intermediate AMD. So you've got two challenges. We got to keep the wet away, and we have to slow down the progression to geographic atrophy. But one of the key things we've learned in the last 15 to 20 years of using these medicines is that the interval is really important. For some people, it's 4 weeks. For other people, it's 8 weeks. If you're super lucky, it could be 10 weeks. But whatever that interval is, we have to make sure that we don't go past it. Because if the wet macular degeneration keeps coming back, so you're at stage 2 dry, you develop wet, we give you medicine, you go back to stage 2, we want to keep you at stage 2. So that personalized interval is very, very important. And people as we get older, we've got other problems, or we may be caring for a partner, or there's lots of things we need to do. We have to be careful that once you develop wet macular degeneration, you're fundamentally on that treatment for life. Although the interval can be extended, it's usually going to be fixed at a particular time. And that's really a run through of what's going on. And thank you for your time. I hope I haven't gone over the time too much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It was a really, really great and clear and informative talk. It's great to hear of the different treatments that are available for patients, but and those that are coming about. Hopefully we'll have better access through the EMA soon for these. So if anyone has any questions for Mark, if you want to pop them into the Q&A box, we can bring them up then later at the Q&A session. So to keep going, our next speakers now are Professor Matthew Campbell, and he'll be followed by Professor Sarah Doyle, who'll give an introduction or an overview then of the ongoing research to AMD.
Thanks, Sean. Can you see my screen there?
Yep, we can.
It's in presenter mode now.
Perfect now, yeah.
Great, excellent. Well, look, thanks to everyone who's joined the webinar, and I'm delighted to be here to tell you a little bit about what's going on in Trinity College and our research. And really following on from Mark, I think you can appreciate that the field of ophthalmology is an incredible field, and that we now have drugs available that can stabilize vision and improve vision in some cases. But it's really important to remember that all of these amazing medications, they started with an idea. And that's where research comes in. And, I think you'll appreciate from Mark's talk as well that there are loads of different types and stages of AMD where we can do better. And we know that we'll be able to do better by being able to design medications that get in at different stages of the disease and better manage the progression. So what I want to do today is just give you a very, very broad overview of what we do in Trinity College, how we do research, how we structure it. And I'll give you a bit of a flavor for some of the interesting data that's coming down the line. So as I mentioned, I'm based in Trinity College in Dublin. Let me see if I can move my screen on. Beautiful university in the heart of the city centre. A lot of people don't know this. And whenever I speak to the public about Trinity College, it's open to the public. So anyone can walk in the front doors of Trinity. It's not guarded in any way. So you can walk in and stroll around the gardens there. And it's a really, really beautiful campus. Over 450 years old. So definitely make a point the next time you're in the city centre of Dublin to walk around the campus of Trinity College. If you walk through the main entrance of Trinity College all the way to the very back of the university, you'll come across this building. That's the Smurfit Institute of Genetics. There's a double helix sculpture outside the front. It was made by the famous Irish sculptor Brian King a number of years ago. And up on the third floor is where I live. That's where we do all the molecular genetics and human molecular genetics, with a real focus on trying to understand the biology of macular degeneration. What is causing this condition that's so prevalent in the aging population in Ireland and throughout the world? So let's just talk briefly about, what the unmet need is here. So we know that this fact that nearly 80% of blindness is preventable. So Mark highlighted the idea of, poor diet, smoking, genetic history. There's a lot of things that are actually preventable. There are some things that aren't, like genetic history, but things like dietary modification and smoking are certainly areas where we can intervene and decrease the risk of developing AMD. But the problem that we face in Ireland is that about 5 people per week are going blind from multiple types of blindness, but also from AMD. And currently, we probably have over 220,000 people in the country who are living with vision impairment, or who are completely centrally or peripherally blind. And when we look at this with our cold, hard economic facts, which we're being bombarded by at the moment with the general election coming up, that the daily cost, or the yearly cost of the economy in Ireland, it exceeds 2.5 billion euro. And obviously, in an aging population, these costs will simply just keep increasing in a linear format. So we really need to find better ways to manage and also treat age-related macular degeneration. And incredibly, so the general elections coming up, we're talking about what's happening in the US and Trump with all his tariffs that are coming along. A lot of the main companies who manufacture these drugs that are used, that eye doctors like Mark use to treat their patients, they're actually manufactured in this country. So we have companies like Regeneron. So Regeneron manufacture Eylea, one of the main drugs that's used for neovascular AMD or wet AMD. So the vast majority of Eylea that's used for the European market is made in Limerick. But there's all these other companies like Alcon and Allergan, Bayer, Novartis, Janssen. They all have sites in Ireland where they do a lot of the manufacturing. And unfortunately, they don't do a huge amount of research in Ireland. So a number of years ago, myself, Mark, and Sarah came together with this idea of, why don't we tap into these companies and see whether they want to collaborate and figure out what are the needs of patients with AMD. What are the types of pathways that we as researchers can tap into to better design new medicines to treat these conditions? And around the time, Science Foundation Ireland, who are now called Research Ireland, they're our main funding body in Ireland, had established a program of funding called the Strategic Partnership Program, or SPP. And the idea behind the SPP was that if researchers and medical doctors could find companies or private sector institutions, charities that wanted to commit money to research, the Irish government would actually match the funding. So it was a 50-50 cost share. So that led us to develop a strategic partnership program that had 4 main partners. So we had Roche, and Roche is the main company that will make most of the drugs that are used to manage and treat neovascular AMD. So the drug that Mark mentioned, Lucentis and Vabysmo, are made by Roche. We also had Eli Lilly, who came on board, and Eli Lilly are interested in pivoting into the ophthalmology space. We also had Progressive Vision, where Mark works, which is a private ophthalmology company, Progressive Vision Research. And finally, we had Fighting Blindness, who are running the webinar. That we got all of these 4 groups together with the idea that they would get involved in research and promote the funding of research. We got a proposal together, put it forward to Science Foundation Ireland, and we received funding of just short of €3 million about 3 years ago. And we call this program the ID, the Science Foundation Ireland ID program. And the concept here was that we were going to do basic research, which I'll get into details about, but also clinical research, try to unpick what were the molecular causes of macular degeneration and a whole range of other blindnesses. So it gave us a really, really strong platform to build our research on. To give you a bit of a research snapshot of who we are and what we're doing. So My lab is very, very focused on macular degeneration at the level of blood vessels. We want to know how the blood vessels in the retina and behind the retina are becoming dysfunctional in AMD. My lab is supported by a number of different funding bodies, most prominently the European Research Council. Sarah, who will be speaking after me, also has European Research Council funding, and Sarah really focuses on the immunobiology and the immune system of the eye, so how the immune system becomes dysfunctional and dysregulated in macular degeneration, and are there parts of the immune system that we can hijack or prevent to control the progression of this condition, AMD. And also Mark, who's a practicing ophthalmologist and who works in both the Eye and Ear Hospital and Progressive Vision, from the clinical angle of directing our clinical research questions that we have. And just by way of a research snapshot, all of these journals that you're looking at here, Cell Reports, JCI Insight, IOVS, Science Translational Medicine, Nature Medicine, these are some of the prominent biomedical journals in the world. And the way that we work is, so we're kind of lab rats. We go into the lab with our idea, we get our hands dirty and we do the experiments. But the way that we disseminate and let the world know about our work is that we publish papers in prominent international journals. And so this is the mechanism of how we get our story out there, to allow the research community to see what we're doing, and also then to allow drug companies to tap on into ideas and to better develop drugs. So as I said at the very, very start, everything started with an idea. So all of our ideas are disseminated through these publications, and that allows the world to be able to see, one, what we're doing, but two, to allow other people and other groups to better develop drugs. So it means that we're not siloed. It's not just us working on this. We want to share all of this information. So when there's funding goes into these projects, all of the outputs of the projects are shared with the international community and the public. Really, really important to note that. This is our team, the ID team. So this gives you an example of what happens when you get a nice research fund just short of €3 million to drive research. So we have nearly 10 people employed in this project, working at all the different stages of research. So working in cells, in flasks, in cell cultures, we call them, to probe the cellular response to different stimuli that we know are associated with AMD. We have animal models. So the animals have eyes as well, and the structure of the retina at the back of the eye that Mark would have detailed is very, very similar across different mammalian species. So we use animal models of macular degeneration to probe and figure out, can potential therapies prevent the rate of degeneration that we see in AMD. And also with Mark and his group in the Eye and Ear Hospital, but also in Progressive Vision Research, we have a group that are heavily aligned with all of our clinical research questions. So we do a lot of clinical imaging in participants and also patients who want to get involved in clinical research. And this is really critically important, that the patient is involved and the patient is front and center in helping us to better design our research. I'll give you some examples in that the public patient involvement that we had in some of our studies involve things as simple as the informed consent documents that people need to sign. The text had to be very, very large for visually impaired people to be able to read it. We also are very cognizant of organizing times of the visits to the clinic, that there are times when there's maximum light available for individuals to arrive at the clinic and make their way to the clinic. Because we appreciate that in conditions like AMD, people will have difficulty with in dim light. So, this whole PPI involvement that Fighting Blindness have spearheaded over the years is really, really central to a lot of the clinical research that we do. So let me just give you some words that people will have heard about before. So people will have heard of translational research. You might have heard of bench to bedside. You might have heard of applied research. But ultimately, all these things, they're just buzzwords for the same thing. This is the concept where we're trying to take findings from cells in a dish or in animal models of a disease, and we're trying to translate them to better inform us on disease prevention in humans, and also the identification and development of drugs. So all of these terms, translational research, bench to bedside, applied research, they all coalesce around the same concept of really trying to develop better drugs to treat humans. So whenever you see these terms being used, they're all really one and the same type of thing. And let me give you a few real world examples of what this looks like from our lab, but also from the clinical research that we do with Mark and his group. So what you're looking at here, Mark talked about OCT images. We can also do OCT imaging in mice. So what you're looking at here is an OCT imager, but it's not for humans, it's for mice. So you can see a little mouse sitting up there on the right-hand side. And the that machine is basically taking pictures at the back of the eye and illuminating the back of the eye in an anesthetized animal. So very, very tightly regulated, this type of work. The animal is completely anesthetized and doesn't feel any pain during this procedure. But this type of imaging allows us to produce images like this. So we have models in the lab where the animals will develop lesions in their retina that are very, very similar to AMD, and especially wet AMD. So they're uncannily similar to wet AMD. And this provides us with model systems to be able to test the next generation of drugs that we hope will be able to prevent the development of these lesions at the back of the eye that Mark described in his patients. What we also do is we use a technique called fundus fluorescein angiography, FFA. And back to translational research, this is the same technique that we're able to use in humans. So the image on the right is an image of a retina of a mouse that has lesions that develop at the back of the retina spontaneously. So it's a beautiful model of wet AMD, and it allows us then to screen drugs. What we've done with this animal is we've injected a fluorescent molecule that lights up the blood vessels of the inner retina and allows us to tell whether these blood vessels are intact or whether they're leaky, because we know that leaky blood vessels are a key driver of wet AMD. Now, as I said, we use the same technique in mice that we use in humans. This is an image of some human fundus fluorescent angiogram. So this is the exact same technique that we use in the preclinical models that we use clinically. And really importantly, so while we really are heavily focused on treating disease and trying to better understand disease like AMD, we also need to better understand what the normal retina looks like. And what I'm showing you here is some fluorescein images of a human that has been injected by a cannula in their hand or in their arm with a fluorescent molecule. We then take pictures of the retina at the back of the eye every 15 seconds for 10 minutes, and you can see the beautiful blood vessels being filled up with this dye. The top images are 2 minutes, 6 minutes, and 10 minutes after we injected this fluorescent dye in young, healthy adults. So men and women between the ages of 18 and 30. Okay, so that's what a normal fluorescein angiogram looks like. But look what happens when we do the exact same study, when we do it in an older population, so in individuals over the age of 65. The images do look different, and you don't need to be an eye doctor to tell that they look different. They're brighter. And so what we've discovered with age, the blood vessels at the back of the eye and the retina become leaky with age. And we think that this is a key driver of priming the retina to convert from normal and healthy retina to AMD retina. So this is a really, really key finding that's come out of the recent SFI SPP program. So we're really excited about this project, and we hope that this will likely be published at some stage in 2025. So I hope that's given you an example of this concept of translational research and how we can move from the bench, the lab bench, to the bedside to better understand and manage disease. What I'll also just finish with the research is that this idea that the mouse retina and smaller animals have a retina that's very, very similar to the human retina. On the left-hand side here is an image of a normal mouse retina, and on the right-hand side here is an image of a mouse model of dry AMD, where you can clearly see there's damage. The pigment is disrupted. The pigmented cells are fat and what we call vesiculated. They're swelling up. And we do a lot of work with the eye bank in Iowa, who are able to collect donor tissue from normal non-diseased eyes, patients who passed away who didn't have any ocular disease. And we also have tissue from patients who would have had geographic atrophy during their lifetime, and their families donate the eyes to research. You can clearly see and appreciate that the type of the pathology and the pattern of the pathology is very, very similar. So it strikes to this idea that using these models, these preclinical models of AMD, are really, really useful for driving our research and addressing the questions that we have. Just to finish off, I would highlight that the proximity of Trinity College to progressive vision is really close. So what we do is we send researchers out to the clinic to collect samples. They collect ocular tissue. They collect blood samples from patients that are involved in our studies. So, we've built this almost a virtual center of translational vision research that we're really proud of. And it's really delivering and expediting the rate at which we can do research. And I do think that the type of research that we're doing with progressive vision is really quite unique in the world for the speed at which we can translate these findings from basic research to clinical research. What I would also say is that we're really, really passionate about education and public engagement. So again, feeding into this idea that we don't sit in these silos. We don't just go into the lab and do all this work and pat each other on the back when we get nice results. we have to go out to the public to educate the public on what we're doing from a research perspective. And what we find really, really useful over the years is doing public dissection. So getting a big bag of cow's eyes and going to schools or holding seminars where kids from primary schools and secondary schools can come in and get to feel a mammalian eye. They can get to dissect it and remove all the component parts. It's one of the best ways to actually figure out how the eye works. So really, really excited about these things. And we do this every year, and we're very, very proud of it. Just to finish off, other clinical projects that are going on in the lab, we do a lot of work on AMD, so always looking for participants and looking for people to get involved in the research. We have a very, very large study looking at the blood vessels in the eye in patients who have diagnosed retinitis pigmentosa. And what we also do, working with colleagues in St. James's Hospital in the neurology department, we look at the retinal manifestation of a lot of neurological diseases. So you got to remember that the retina is part of the brain. It's the only part of the brain that comes out of encased bone. So we can better understand a lot of rare neurological disorders by looking at the retina. So we're really, really excited and thankful to all the funding bodies who have supported this work, especially Fighting Blindness, and hoping to continue this on long into the future. So delighted to take any questions at the end, and I'll pass over to Sarah.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Okay. Can you see that?
Looks good.
You can, yep.
Great. Okay, thanks. So thanks to Fighting Blindness for asking us to speak here today, and thanks to everyone who's joined. So my name is Sarah Doyle, and I'm a professor in immunology in Trinity College in Dublin. And really, as Matt referred to, my research interests really focus on the immune system. And so thankfully, because I'm coming after both Mark and Matt, I get to really focus in on the immune system because they've introduced the disease so well. And my team, we really work on understanding the mechanisms behind retinal degeneration, because really it's understanding these triggers of disease that will allow us to treat the kind of the underlying disease and not just the symptoms. So we work in Trinity College Institute of Neuroscience, which is this building here. It's also at the kind of back end of Trinity if you're coming in through under Front Arch. And this is a great building to work in because it's so full of other neuroscientists as well. So we have people working on the brain and on the eye there. And so, as I said, we're interested in what triggers the immune response in AMD and how those immune signals are activated, because this is going to really allow us to understand what the initial triggers of disease are. So why are we interested in the immune system per se for age-related macular degeneration? Well, I'm going to use an apple here as an analogy for what age does to a biological system. So if we look here, we can see that over time, if you just leave an apple on a desk, you can see that the organization of the tissue is kind of breaking down over time until really what you're getting is kind of gas being released and total cell breakdown. And this kind of tissue breakdown is actually going on constantly in our bodies, and our bodies are constantly trying to prevent this kind of tissue breakdown. And the system that works to keep our tissues and our organs in place and functioning really, really healthily is our immune system. So our immune system has really evolved with us over time in order to maintain the order of our bodies. And so inflammation is one arm of the immune system, and this is really the arm of the immune system that we work on in the lab. And inflammation has had a really bad reputation over the years, because we think of inflammation, we think of maybe swollen skin, we think of rheumatoid arthritis, heat, pain, that kind of thing. But actually inflammation is really, really important for tissue healing as well as causing tissue damage. And so inflammation and the immune system have really evolved with us in order to maintain the status quo, so to keep our bodies healthy. If we have too little inflammation, we actually get a situation where you mightn't be able to clear infections, and you mightn't be able to heal wounds. And we see that with diabetes, that the wound healing response in people really decreases, and it can take a very long time to heal. However, if we have too much inflammation, we can see autoimmunity. We can see that there might be chronic inflammatory diseases, such as the rheumatoid arthritis that I mentioned. And that's because too much inflammation can cause tissue damage. So the cells that are involved in the inflammatory system, when they're activated, they produce like bleaches. And that's really, really important for kind of clearing bacteria and pathogens. But obviously that can kind of damage the surrounding tissue as well. So it's a real balance when it comes to inflammation. It's kind of the quintessential Goldilocks effect that you have. You really want it to just be enough inflammation in order to maintain tissue integrity without causing tissue damage. And so in terms of kind of age-related macular degeneration and age in general, there are an awful lot of potential what we call damage-associated molecular patterns, or DAMPs. So these could be things like cholesterol crystals, or amyloid beta crystals, or even just kind of bits of cells that have erupted and died in a dysregulated fashion. And so as we age, we kind of gather these DAMPs over time, and they can activate the inflammatory system even in the absence of infection. And that's the kind of activation of the immune system that we're interested in for AMD. And we know that the immune system is really important, or at least has a role in AMD and in retinal degeneration in general, actually, because we can see it. So on the left here is a picture of a human donor eye. So in this case, the eye has been kind of flattened out, and we're looking en face at the back of the eye. And what you can see here is that there's little white cells, and those white cells are immune cells. Now, under normal circumstances, you don't really see any immune cells in the back of the eye. So we know that this is because of the disease, the AMD. And actually, interestingly, we also see the movement of immune cells, which here we've stained in green, in a mouse model of disease. So we know that, kind of, as Matt was talking about, we can translate some of this kind of human observations and mouse observations. So we can use these mouse models then to study the migration and the involvement of these immune cells in macular degeneration, or models of macular degeneration. And so really, when it comes to studying the immune system in any of these kind of age-related diseases or sterile diseases where there's no infection involved, the holy grail is to limit the tissue damage, but promote healing and regeneration. So again, it's just making sure that you can kind of drive enough of an immune response to get healing, but not so much that you get the kind of bystander tissue damage. And so in our lab, we actually work at some of the different, like all of the different stages, in fact, of AMD. So Mark really nicely introduced the fact that there are different stages of AMD. And so one of the things that we look at is we are looking to see if we can figure out what the triggers are of dry AMD. And to do that, we're looking at early immune signals in people who are unaffected by AMD and in people who have dry AMD. So we're looking to see if we can pick up different immune signatures, in people who have the dry AMD that aren't there in the healthy non-AMD donors. And what that allows us to do then, once we can pick up these signatures, is it allows us to work backwards and kind of figure out what the triggers are that push those pathways forward. So one of the things that's really interesting in this kind of project where we're looking at these early signatures is that we also have to take into account the aging immune system. So as we age, our immune system changes from what it was earlier on in life. In fact, it's kind of changing over the whole life course. And so we have to take into account the difference between an aged immune system and a younger immune system, and then the aged immune system and what the immune system looks like in AMD, so that we can really pick out what might be different about AMD and simply aging. And so we have some really nice data on the differences between the aging immune system and an AMD immune system. And we can see that there are certain immune cells that are just a little less able to proliferate and migrate to areas of injury. So this kind of research is only possible because of the close relationship that we have with Mark in Progressive Vision, and with Matt's group as well. We really all work very well together. And so with Mark, we collect peripheral blood from people with and without AMD. And what we're able to do with that blood is we're able to spin it down and separate it out into its component parts. And so the component parts of blood are plasma, the white blood cells that you might have heard of, and then the red blood cells. And so we can use this plasma to look for soluble factors that have been released by immune cells. And we can also look at the actual immune cells themselves by taking the white blood cells and isolating them. So in addition to looking for the triggers of dry AMD, we're also interested in how immune signals might be involved in the switch from being someone with dry AMD to someone with wet AMD. So this is another really exciting project that we have in the lab at the moment. And again, we're particularly interested in looking at kind of the cellular responses, which means that we're looking at the different types of white blood cells that are found at the wet AMD lesions, and also the soluble factors, so the cytokines that are released by immune cells into the plasma. And those, because what those cytokines do is they're going out and telling the surrounding tissue that there is damage to the area. So one of the ways that we're trying to understand this kind of switch from dry to wet is also, to understand how wet AMD is occurring, is also to look at how the immune system might be able to stabilize the neovessels. Because remember, I said that the immune system really, it's there to maintain tissue stability and tissue organization. And so what we're looking to see is if there are factors in the immune system that can help stabilize the neovessels, which tend to be very leaky. And then finally, we look at subretinal fibrosis. So subretinal fibrosis is one kind of the end stage of neovascular AMD. Not everyone will get it, but some people will get fibrosis. And you can see here in this image how this was a person who had been probably undertreated with anti-VEGFs and had developed subretinal fibrosis here. And what that means is that they've developed a scar underneath their retina, and that scar is going to interfere with vision. Now, what you can see here is that you can also see these what are called cystic changes, which is just fluid in the retina. And after 10 months of intensified dosing, we can see that the fluid has resolved, but the scar still remains. So we know that scarring still remains a health challenge. And so one of the things that we're also trying to do is to understand what are the triggers that are driving this scar formation in order to be able to see if we can intervene at points where you can prevent scarring from happening in potentially vulnerable people. So just as a final, as an example of one of the ways that we're trying to harness the immune response is we discovered kind of this natural process in the white blood cells, in the immune cells, that a particular danger signal is able to drive the production of these cytokines that I was talking about. And so these are the soluble factors that can then speak to the tissue in the surrounding area. And one of these cytokines really can cause quite severe tissue damage, whereas the other appears to be involved in wound healing. And so what we're interested in doing is manipulating this natural process for drug development. And so taking the cytokine that's involved in wound healing and injecting this into the eye. So this is only in preclinical stages in mice. But if we inject this into the eye, we can actually see that there's a wound healing response and we prevent further disease. So again, kind of taking our understandings of what's triggering immune system activation in AMD and hopefully manipulating it for drug development. So that's it from me. I just want to thank all the donors. So some of you may have been involved in our research, so thank you if you've donated blood, and to all the funding agencies that we've worked with, and Mark and Matt, Fighting Blindness. Thank you.
Thanks to Matt and Sarah for really, really interesting talks. It's great to see how much work is going on here in Ireland into AMD and furthering the understanding of AMD and its progression, as well as trying to find ways in which to stabilize it. So thanks again for a really, really interesting talk. And so if anybody has any questions for Matthew or Sarah, feel free to pop into the Q&A box and we can discuss it then later on in our Q&A session. And so with that, I will now introduce our next speakers. It's our Head of Support Services for Fighting Blindness, Ms. Marta O'Connor, and our Advocacy Officer, Declan Mina. If you'd like to join us now, they'll give us a brief idea of the work that's ongoing in Fighting Blindness for both advocacy and support.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on these lovely sunny days. And thank you very much to Sarah and Mark and Matthew to providing us with such a in-depth information. I really hope that it will be helpful for a lot of people who are here with us today. I'm Marta O'Connor and I'm Head of Support Services in Fighting Blindness. And I very briefly would like to tell you about our services and what's available to people with sight loss, as well, of course, as people with AMD. So in Fighting Blindness, of course, our main focus is it's research, and that's what we are very proud of. However, we do acknowledge that people with sight loss, as well as their family members, friends and closed ones, the journey of living with sight loss or finding out about your condition can be very difficult and very challenging. So we acknowledge that and try to support our community by providing counseling services, first of all. So we provide free of charge counseling services to anyone impacted by sight loss, as well as their family members and friends and any other significant ones. Our counseling services are delivered over the phone. They can be delivered online, but also we do have in-person counseling in Dublin and also in Cork. So if anyone of people who are here today would like to avail of those services, they are available for you. There are no waiting lists, so you can just get in touch with us by contacting us on email, which is insight@fightingblindness.ie, or the phone number, which is 01674 6496. You can also find all the information on the website. Apart from the counseling services, we offer a very valuable service, which is peer support groups. We have a number of different peer support groups. One of them is actually a group specifically for people impacted by AMD. It's a great space where you can gather with people who, may be facing similar challenges to you, and can, exchange your experience and support each other. All of our groups are chaired and facilitated by our members of community. Majority of people of our facilitators are living with sight loss as well. So there is that element of lived experience, which is invaluable. We have quite a lot of different support groups. As I said, we have the AMD and other groups which are solely focused on specific eye conditions, but then we have also more general groups which meet on different days, different times. You can all find the information about our support groups on our website. Specifically, the AMD group takes place on every third Tuesday of the month, and it takes place from 3 o'clock till 4:30, and it's an online group. Majority of our groups are online. However, we do have a couple of groups which are taking place in person in Dublin as well. So you're more than welcome to join. And apart from the two pillars of support we do have in Fighting Blindness, meaning counseling and support groups, we also are very proud of different projects we deliver for the community. And that's kind of, we are taking a more holistic view on mental health and well-being in Fighting Blindness. So we deliver a project like Dance for All, which is a wonderful space where people can meet, and it's focused around dance and somatic movement, but it's of course tailored specifically to people with sight loss. We have the yoga for people with visual impairment. We have project which is focused around art, and it's a sculpture project. So all of our projects take place in Dublin and also in Cork. So if you would like to join us for any of that, or to be informed of what's happening in support and in terms of support and in our department in Fighting Blindness, please feel free to get in touch with us. Thank you very much, and I will pass it on to my colleague, Declan.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, perfect, Declan.
My name is Declan. I'm Advocacy Officer of Fighting Blindness, and I think it's important that we just pause and reflect on all the great work that's been done. Doctors are doing great work, researchers, and Fighting Blindness are working as partners with them, but researchers are working very hard and making real progress. Patient organizations are working really hard to advocate for more research to get drugs approved. And I know we've seen some of that at the Retina International World Congress. Hopefully some of you are able to attend. But also patients are doing great work. And I really want to thank everyone who is living with these conditions who, when you realize that you have this condition, that that you take part, that you share your story, which can be so difficult, but is so useful. When you help our great researchers do the work they do by taking part in PPI activities, or when you help us advocate by filling in surveys, I want to thank you. I'm going to say that there is a lot of work to be done, and there will be a lot of work next year. It's already said, and it's very disappointing, that the European Medicines Agency has put a block on one treatment for AMD, and another one has been withdrawn. We support regulation, and it's really important that regulation is there so that you know that what you're being treated with is safe. But when the regulation isn't working, we have to start a campaign, and we have to work on that, and we are doing that. We're engaging with Retina International, and we're working very hard to make sure that your voice is at the table. Because if people ignore the voice of patients, then we are going to have a less effective health system. So the number one action everyone can take right now is to make sure you're registered with us on the VIP network. This is a network where you are told of opportunities related to advocacy and research, to be involved in public and patient involvement, and to help us. So at the moment, we have a survey on wet AMD, and this is related to a regulatory process, not the EMA. This is about the Irish government paying for it, because there is that disparity where even after something gets through the European Medicines Agency and it's safe to access in Europe, the Irish government wait. And we have just waited 1,500 days to get access to a treatment called Luxturna for RP. That's not acceptable. And it is only through your voice, through you being on the VIP network and taking part, that we can actually improve these decisions, and that these decisions work for everyone. Mainly they work for patients. It's not acceptable that people are left behind when there are perfectly good treatments. So that is the hard work we're going to continue to do next year. Hopefully you'll join us in that fight. I know some of you already are, and that's great. And we really look forward to what, I think the message from today, there is hope already. There's a lot of hope, and there's hope, we're going to have a lot more treatments and a lot more work to be done. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Declan, and to Marta. It's great to share how much work is going on in fighting blindness and what support is available to the public. So following on from the topics that Marta spoke about in terms of the different supports available, as well as the VIP network and various information that Declan shared, we can follow up and we can share this information with you after the webinar as well, so that you know where to find that information. And we're happy to take any questions you might have about that too. So at this point, I think I might welcome our speakers back for a Q&A panel session. We've received quite a few questions ahead, and there's a few there in the chat box. So I might start with some of the questions that we received ahead of the webinar. So we have one here aimed for Mark, and it's about the Valida treatment that you had discussed. So you've already covered quite a bit of it actually already through your talk, which is great. But one attendee has asked what quantifiable parameters are being used to determine if an individual is getting benefit from Valida, and would it be possible to get trend analysis reports?
You're muted, Mark.
Yeah, no, thanks. Sorry, say that again. What are the...
Apologies, Mark. It's what are the quantifiable parameters that are being used to determine if an individual is getting benefit from Valida, and will it be possible to get trend analysis reports?
The short answer on the trend analysis. So what we measure when it comes to Valida is, one, if your vision changes. So that we're measuring your vision before and after and during the procedure. And after, in between cycles. So that's our key thing, is your vision changing. The second thing that we're measuring is the volume of the drusen that are seen on OCT, and whether that volume is reducing. And then over a longer period of time, it's to see if you're having it for geographic atrophy, if the geographic atrophy is progressing or not. Then one of the other things that happens, it doesn't work for everybody. So the problem is that some people will have the treatment and they will progress, either that they will progress to geographic atrophy, or they will go from stage 2 to wet macular degeneration. And that can happen even with treatment. Valida is only being approved by the FDA recently, and in the real world, with what will happen eventually is we'll have a better way of showing people, like we do with the wet macular degeneration treatment, we'll have a better way of showing people how they're doing. I do think that AI application, where we can use AI to measure the thickness of the photoreceptors and the RPE, will probably, over time, when it's available and we know how to use it correctly, will also be a way that we'll be able to show progression, or, well, not progression, but that the fact that the treatment is preventing change, so that you're maintaining a thicker photoreceptor level than you would be otherwise. That's going to take some time to develop that. That's only a new concept.
Thanks, Mark. And that actually it leads into another question that we actually received, which I think would be nice to follow on with. Someone has asked if you maybe be able to speak a little bit more about the AI to identify those who will have fast progression, and if this use is in Ireland currently, or when we could expect that roughly to be available.
So the fast progression idea has not really taken off in the medical community yet, because people are still thinking about macular degeneration in this. They're not identifying. It hasn't been people are not really understanding that they have to identify stage 2 intermediate dry AMD with large confluent drusen. The work done on the AI application was done by an Austrian doctor called Ursula Schmidt-Erfurt, and that was presented at the American Academy of Ophthalmology and published in Ophthalmology, which is a major eye medicine journal, last year. And she presented it 2 years ago at the meeting, and it was presented in the middle of a sub-day specialty, and it made no ripples whatsoever. Nobody even commented on it. Now, when she stood up and talked about it, I don't know her very well. I was absolutely amazed. My jaw dropped. I went, "This is genius." And I went over to her on the way out. She doesn't know me from Adam, and she looked a bit defeated. She's like, "Nobody really picked up on that." And I said to her, this is clearly really important. And the people who are making the C3 inhibitor molecule, they also think it's very important, because this will gain traction. Because what we want is, for dry macular degeneration, we want to catch it much earlier. So when you start to develop early dry stage 2 confluent drusen, that's when we want to start seeing, are your photoreceptors, what are they doing? What are your RPE doing? So you come to see us and you've got stage 1 AMD. We say, "Hey, listen, come back in a year." When you come back, and if you've got stage 2, it's going to change in the next year or two about what we're doing. It's a bit like diabetic retinopathy, which is a totally different eye disease. But when people get to a certain point of diabetic retinopathy, they need to start thinking about treatment. And it's going to be very similar for dry AMD. But because when you're involved in research and collaborations like we have in Progressive Vision with Matt and Sarah, we tend to be ahead of the curve. So it takes a while to make sure something is truly going to work. And then it takes a while for the main body of people to come in behind. So, in the old sayings, you can always tell the pioneers, because they're the ones with the arrows in their backs. But this AI application, which we think is a validated system and can be used on the machines that we use in our clinic day to day, we've contacted the Ursula's company that makes it, to see what the cost is, to see, can we apply it as an innovative thing, starting probably after Christmas. So yes, it's going to come. Yes, it will take us a while to understand what it shows, but I do think this idea of fast progressors, that nobody has really cottoned on to that, except, for example, us, Ursula, and other people who really understand the challenge of dry AMD. Geographic atrophy is a challenge, and we can treat it. And the sad thing is that those C3 inhibitors should have been allowed for fast progressors, or they should have put in some sort of thing to say, well, under certain circumstances, we will allow it, because it's a safe medicine. But they just, anyway, but I think that this is like late breaking news. This is brand new. This is hot off the press. But we have to be careful that as we pull this technology into our clinic, we have to understand, how do we identify people who it might help? And how do we identify, when we've identified those people, how do we help them understand what it's going to do? So all of this is we're developing at the moment.
Yes. Thanks, Mark. It's great to see how much is coming on board, but obviously,
it's so exciting. I mean, for the right people, these treatments are going to revolutionize their experience, and then they will lead into other treatments, or we'll be able to apply them for other diseases. So, but it's sort of like when we first got intraocular injections for wet AMD, we didn't give them half enough. We didn't understand that people were going to live for 15 years. So it completely changes in real world what we're starting to do. It can changes over time so that it becomes much more effective. It's the same as all medicine, whether it's heart disease, AFib. We used to never treat AFib. Now everybody gets their AFib treated because it's such strong association with stroke. So all of these things, you have to be ready to know that you're going to have to change all the time.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that, Mark. I suppose on the topic of the progression of research and how long things take, we actually have another question for Matt and Sarah. Generally asking, how long does it take generally for research to turn into treatments from the lab?
Yeah, I can start answering the question. It's a great question, so thanks for it. It really depends. So there are sometimes there's serendipity involved, where you might find a signaling process or a way that a disease occurs that you might say, actually, that drug that's used to treat a different disease might have utility in treating AMD. So sometimes when that happens, it can just be serendipitous, and you can kind of fast track and design clinical trials to pivot a drug that's already on the market for use in AMD. But if you're talking about the idea of from identifying a molecule that we know has a very, very strong predictive factor that it's going to drive the course of the disease, and then looking at designing a medication, be it an antibody-based medication like Lucentis, or an advanced therapy like an siRNA or a gene therapy, really, it's very, very difficult to put a time on it. If you look in the general drug development scenario, people will talk about it basically takes about 10 years. Okay, so by the time you get molecule discovered to actually an approved drug is 10 years. But that's not just 10 years, it's also 10 years plus money. So to get a drug beyond phase 3 clinical trials with approval costs approximately $700 million. So, there's loads of moving parts to it. No hard and fast answer to one thing, but it does take time. And the problem is that it's littered with risks as well. So you always open the Daily Mail and the next best drug for AMD or Alzheimer's. But sometimes drugs, they just don't make it through the whole process, the phased process of clinical trials for loads of different reasons. But the idea is that we never have just one molecule we focus on. We've got loads of different things that we're focused on. So you kind of will hope that eventually you'll hit the eye.
Yes. I don't know if Sarah, if you had anything else to add to that.
No, in my head, I was just thinking it's a minimum 10 years. That's kind of the standard answer. And it does, I think, depend on the modality, the drug modality as well. So you might get the antibodies through a bit quicker because we know like they have kind of a bit of a safety profile already. There's kind of so many of them already in clinics, both for AMD and for many other different diseases. But once you start kind of getting into newer types of drugs, then it can take that bit longer as well. So
sure. Yeah, thanks guys for your response on that. We also, while I have you there, we also have a question about how someone could become part of your research. They mentioned that they live in Mayo, so they're not really close to Dublin, but they have both wet and dry macular degeneration.
Yeah. That's probably a question for Mark, because we work with Mark on the clinical side.
Yeah. So yeah, we run lots of different trials. And sometimes people just come to have an assessment. We have 2 clinics, one in Swords and one in Sandyford, and they both have researchers there. And sometimes what people can do, which can be very helpful, is to come to have an assessment and agree to let us take pictures and to give us some blood samples. And then that allows us to build up a profile of what a person with a certain point of AMD has. And the more of those sample patients that we have gives us, and the images that we're taking allow us then to apply this to other people. So that's one way to do it. There are clinical trials ongoing all the time. The clinical trials for wet macular degeneration have now really probably predominantly come to an end. We were involved in some trials about 10 years ago. We were involved with a trial for an implantable medicine, which is not being pushed forward into the EU because it's very expensive and has problems. But there will be more trials, and particularly for dry macular degeneration. So they come up, the suitability for trials, a call for trials. You may start to see now more in Ireland, where you'll see, for example, us in media saying clinical trial interested people are asked would they like to be part of that. So that's going to, but just having an assessment and allowing us to take blood is certainly one way to do it. We have no plans, unfortunately, at the moment to open a clinic near Mayo, but if we do, again, we let everybody know. Opening clinics are very labor intensive.
Just to clarify there, actually, you don't have to be part of a clinical trial to be part of clinical research.
No.
So anyone can, kind of contact us to be part of clinical research as long as they're for us to take their eye pictures and the bloods, and that they can be part of.
It doesn't take that long as well. So, if you're planning a trip from Mayo, you get the bus or the train down, and probably a session takes, maximum about an hour and a half for the clinical research that we're doing. An hour and a half to 2 hours you'd need to put aside. And yeah.
Every donor is very welcome.
Thanks for that. I think it's great to hear that there's so many options there for people to get involved in as well here in Ireland. Because we did have another question around the topic of clinical trials, asking generally how come there are none available for AMD in Ireland at the moment. Sorry, actually Declan, if you want to come in?
Yeah, so just on a policy thing around clinical trials, it is part of advocacy to actually advocate for more trials. And one of the interesting things that we're hearing is it's actually the lack of a digital health record that can make it harder for these trials to go ahead. So I know, there's a lot kind of going around, but one of the things to remember is we need a strong digital health record, and we need people to support strong digital health records, because when companies want to do these trials, they're very expensive. They want to make sure that people are eligible, and they want good records that they can quickly check and, have it all there. So that's one of the things we're advocating for, is a strong digital health record, which will help a lot more clinical trials to be attracted to Ireland. But I suppose it is something we're advocating for generally, because clinical trials, by the time something goes into patients, it's already been deemed quite safe, and it's, they're very well run, and it is how we get new innovative medicines. So it is very important. But one of the reasons anyway is the digital health record.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I was going to actually bring that point up, Declan. We identified that about 10 years ago, longer, the importance of an electronic patient record, and also the correct patient management system. We have, and that's one of the reasons we've been involved in clinical trials in the past, and why we think there's an opportunity for Progressive Vision Research to bring some of these more innovative trials into the country. They're very expensive to maintain, and a lot of people don't want to pay for the cost of the actual software and then the maintenance for it. There's an accreditation process that is ongoing that's required. And the one that we use, we have two. We actually have one that we use for patient visits, and then we have a separate one that we use for trials that we're undertaking with Matt and Sarah in some of the early studies that we do, where we have postgraduate doctors and optometrists and other researchers working with us. And I think we're probably getting to the point where there will be an electronic patient record for eye medicine by default. The number one electronic patient record being used in the country is also the number one being used in other European countries and in the UK. So I think that is a big deal, a good electronic patient record.
Thanks, everyone. It's great to have all your different input on that too, and it's definitely a very important topic that we're all currently very interested in. I'm conscious of the time. I don't want to hold too many people up, so I might just pick the last few questions I can push through. So we have one question that was brought to us. I think this would be aimed at you, Mark. There's a person who has been diagnosed with both dry and wet AMD in the same eye. They hadn't heard of this before and want to know what they might be able to do about the dry in the same eye.
Yeah. So I think that's a question that we hear a lot. And I think that's why I try to show that the understanding, this innovative new understanding of dry macular degeneration is stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. The wet comes from stage 2. When you get wet and you treat it, you go back to stage 2. And of all the eye doctors in training that I work with when I work in the eye and ear, and people who work with us in Progressive Vision, we're trying to get them to understand how to help people understand who have this disease, that they need to understand how to explain it clearly. So everybody has dry, and you get wet macular degeneration from stage 2 dry for these confluent drusen. When you get your treatment, you go back to stage 2, and then we need to try and slow you down getting into stage 3 dry, where you get geographic atrophy. But you've got to keep the wet at bay. That's very, very important. How do you slow down the dry? Good, healthy diet. making sure you're taking pigment supplements helps stop you going from stage 2 back to the wet. That's really clear. Looking after your blood pressure. Your diet is really important, so you don't have a lot of inflammatory things in your diet. You don't have a lot of red meat. You're not drinking a lot of alcohol. You're eating whole fruit. You're eating vegetables. All of that is going to slow down your progression from stage 2 to stage 3. And getting advice and making sure you're getting your checks and making your injection appointments is very, very important. Now, the injections have potential complications, which include an infection in your eye, but the risk of those complications is outweighed heavily by the benefit. But it is a two-front. If you have wet macular degeneration, you're fighting on two fronts. So you got to keep it dry and then slow down the dry progressing.
And just to say as well there that one of the greatest ways of delaying progression, give up smoking.
Oh yeah, smoking and
that's
vaping.
Actually the biggest, the best thing you can do for yourself.
Yeah, so smoking is worse than anything else, and then nicotine, unfortunately, is bad. So vaping is better than smoking, but no smoking is better than vaping, and no vaping is better than. It's a bit tough to give up cigarettes. It's terrible.
Thanks for your feedback there, guys. So just because of the time, I might just end it on one final question that we received. Can hereditary AMD be delayed or prevented? Whoever might want to.
You could get old, you could get younger. Benjamin Button. I don't know. So what the hereditary AMD, if it's not an inherited retinal disease, there are a few diseases that you inherit, a thing called Best's disease, which looks like stage 2 dry macular degeneration, but it's not. The idea of the hereditary one, from a progression of the disease, it pushes you earlier along. So instead of getting drusen when you're 75, you may get them when you're 65. And then if you have real age-related macular degeneration, which has a hereditary component, so your brothers and sisters have it, then when you're at stage 2 confluent drusen of dry macular degeneration, that's really when you need to be getting checked regularly. So, you know, that person that you go to see is saying to you, listen, you don't have any wet changes. How's your diet? You know, really understanding your risk factors, seeing are you a candidate for Valida to try and get those confluent drusen less. If you've got a hereditary component and it's age-related, you're getting it earlier. If you have pure inherited macular degeneration, I know that Sarah and myself and Matt have talked about this, that some of the things we're learning from dry macular degeneration may be applicable, certainly to inherited retinal diseases, as we're understanding more about dry macular degeneration.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, everyone, for all your feedback and all the questions. I know we've slightly run over time there, so I think with that, we'll close our Q&A session. Thank you all very much for your attending today and reaching out. We have the list of questions here, and we can try to get back to you for people who didn't get your question answered. And also, thank you very much to all of our speakers today for taking the time to come here and giving such really interesting talks. I know it's been a really great afternoon, and I hope you've all enjoyed attending this event today.